The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was that I was not in my own apartment. The second was the deep navy blazer wrapped around me, the one my billionaire boss wore to nearly every important board meeting. Soft morning sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Eleanor Brooks's penthouse. I had been there hundreds of times as her executive assistant, arriving before meetings or leaving after late work sessions. Never like this. Never waking up on the sofa with a blanket over me, my head heavy, and the previous evening broken into fragments I could not quite connect. I sat up slowly and stared at the silver lining inside the cuffs. I knew that blazer. I just had no idea how I had ended up wearing it. Before I could gather my thoughts, quiet footsteps approached from the kitchen. Eleanor appeared carrying 2 mugs of coffee, dressed in a crisp white blouse with charcoal slacks, her blonde hair neatly tied back despite the early hour. She looked composed as always, but there was something different in her eyes. She seemed tired. Not physically exhausted, but emotionally worn, as though sleep had never truly found her. When she noticed I was awake, she offered a gentle smile that looked almost relieved. "Good morning, Natalie." Her voice remained calm and steady. "How are you feeling?" I searched her expression, hoping it might reveal the answer hidden somewhere inside the missing hours of the previous night. Confused, I admitted honestly. I accepted the coffee she offered, grateful for the warmth in my hands. "Why am I here?" She hesitated for only a second before replying. "You needed a safe place to rest." The answer sounded carefully chosen. "And the blazer?" I asked, lightly holding the sleeve again. Her eyes followed the movement before returning to mine. "You needed that too." I waited for the rest of the explanation, but none came. The silence between us stretched comfortably for her and unbearably for me. I frowned slightly. "What happened after the charity gala?" Eleanor looked toward the windows before answering. "You were exhausted, soaked through, and barely keeping your eyes open. The roads toward your apartment were getting worse, so I brought you here." Nothing happened that crossed a line. I studied her face. "Then why does it feel like you are leaving something out?" Her expression tightened slightly. "Because I do not want to tell you what the night meant. That part has to belong to you." Her words left me even more puzzled than before. Bits of memory flickered without connecting. Rain falling across the hotel entrance. Bright city lights reflected on wet pavement. Someone placing a warm jacket around my shoulders. A familiar voice quietly telling me everything was going to be all right. The images vanished as quickly as they appeared. I looked back at Eleanor. "Please," I said. "Just tell me what happened." She held my gaze. "I will tell you every fact I remember. I just will not tell you what you were supposed to feel about any of it." I wanted to argue, but something inside me stopped. It was not fear. It was the unmistakable realization that Eleanor, the woman who always answered every difficult question in every boardroom without hesitation, had spent the entire night protecting a truth she refused to let become my burden. As she reached for her untouched coffee, I noticed something I had completely missed until then. Her eyes were tired, but not because she had worked late. It looked as though she had never gone to bed at all. Leaving the penthouse should have made me feel better, but every step toward the private elevator only seemed to deepen the mystery I carried with me. Eleanor walked beside me in complete silence, her usual confidence softened by a quiet thoughtfulness I had never seen before. The blazer still rested comfortably over my shoulders, carrying a faint scent of cedarwood and fresh linen that somehow felt reassuring even though I could not explain why. As the elevator descended toward the underground parking garage, I searched my memory again, hoping another missing piece would appear. I remembered the ballroom glowing beneath crystal chandeliers. I remembered laughing with members of the charity board after the fundraiser ended. Then came flashes that refused to connect. Rain falling harder than anyone expected. The hotel entrance crowded with guests, waiting for their cars. My umbrella turning inside out in the wind. After that, everything dissolved into scattered impressions. I remembered hearing Eleanor call my name. I remembered reaching for something steady. I remembered warmth settling across my shoulders, but I could not remember whether it came from the blazer or from the calm certainty in her voice. The elevator doors opened, and our driver was already waiting beside the company sedan. Eleanor opened the rear passenger door before I could reach for it myself. That simple gesture surprised me. She had always been considerate, but today every movement seemed unusually careful, almost protective. During the drive back to headquarters, the city drifted past the windows beneath gray morning clouds. Neither of us spoke for several minutes. Finally, I broke the silence. Did I embarrass myself last night? Eleanor turned toward me immediately. Never. Her answer arrived so quickly that I believed it without question. Did I say something I should not have said? She smiled. No. Then why does everything after the rain feel so fragmented? Her expression softened. Because you were exhausted, cold, and half asleep by the time we left. You fell asleep in the car and woke only briefly when we got upstairs. There is no mystery there, Natalie. You were simply worn out. I wanted to ask another question, but the sincerity in her voice made it difficult to keep pushing. When we arrived at headquarters, everything looked exactly as it always did. Employees greeted Eleanor with quiet respect. She acknowledged each person with the same composed professionalism that had earned her admiration throughout the company. If anyone noticed I was wearing her blazer, nobody mentioned it. Inside my office, I tried to return to my normal routine. I organized meeting agendas, confirmed conference calls, reviewed travel schedules, and answered emails, yet my attention kept drifting back to the missing hours. Every time I glanced through the glass wall toward Eleanor's office, I found her working with perfect focus, but every so often she would briefly look up as though checking that I was all right. Around lunchtime, our human resources director stopped by my desk carrying paperwork for an upcoming executive retreat. She smiled warmly before saying, "I heard the weather became awful after the gala. I am glad the chief executive officer made sure everyone got home safely." I looked up immediately. Everyone? She nodded. She personally stayed until the last employee had transportation. That sounds exactly like her. After she walked away, I remained completely still. Eleanor had stayed behind for everyone else, just as she always did. Yet somehow I had been the one who woke up inside her penthouse wearing her blazer while she looked as though she had not slept at all. I slowly lowered my eyes to the sleeve resting across my desk, and for the first time I noticed something tucked carefully inside the inner pocket. It was a neatly folded note written in familiar handwriting, but before I could open it, a gentle knock sounded on my office door. The gentle knock at my office door startled me just enough that I quickly slipped the folded note back into the inside pocket of the blazer without reading it. "Come in," I called, hoping my voice sounded steadier than I felt. Eleanor stepped inside carrying a tablet and a small folder. Her expression was calm as always, but there was an unmistakable softness in her eyes whenever she looked at me that I had somehow never noticed before. "I wanted to make sure you were feeling better," she said. "If today is too much, you can go home early." I almost laughed. "You have never suggested that before." A faint smile crossed her face. "There are exceptions to every routine." She placed the folder on my desk before turning to leave, but I spoke before she reached the door. "Eleanor." She stopped immediately. "Did something happen last night that you think would change the way I see you?" She remained perfectly still for several seconds before slowly turning back toward me. "I hope not," she answered honestly. "Then why are you protecting me from the truth?" She lowered her eyes briefly, searching for words with a care I had never seen during board meetings or investor presentations. "Because I can tell you what I saw, but I do not want my version to become your memory." She looked at me again. "You were safe. You were respected. And nothing happened that took your choices away from you." Before I could ask another question, her phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, apologized quietly, and left for an executive meeting. The office suddenly felt much larger after she was gone. I waited until the hallway became quiet before reaching into the blazer pocket again. My fingers carefully unfolded the small piece of paper. It contained only one sentence written in Eleanor's elegant handwriting. If you wake up confused, please remember that you never had to face a single moment alone. I read the sentence 3 times. There was no signature because none was needed. My heart tightened with a feeling I could not quite name. It did not sound like someone hiding a mistake. It sounded like someone carrying a responsibility they never wanted me to bear. Throughout the afternoon, tiny fragments of the previous evening continued surfacing without warning. During a budget presentation, I suddenly remembered standing beneath the covered entrance of the hotel while heavy rain poured across the street. I remembered searching my purse for my phone. I remembered shivering as an unexpected gust of wind swept through the driveway. Then another image appeared. Eleanor gently placing her blazer across my shoulders while saying, "You are freezing." The memory disappeared before I could reach anything else. Later that day, I delivered revised meeting schedules to Eleanor's office. She was standing beside the windows reviewing documents, the afternoon sunlight outlining the city behind her. When she noticed I was still wearing the blazer, she smiled almost imperceptibly. "It looks warmer on you than it ever did on me," she said. I looked down at the sleeve before meeting her eyes again. "I found your note." For the first time since I had known her, Eleanor seemed genuinely surprised. She looked toward the desk, then back at me, as though she had forgotten she placed it there. "I wrote that very early this morning," she admitted quietly. "I was not sure whether you would ever see it." I studied her face carefully. Everything about her suggested kindness, patience, and restraint rather than secrecy. Yet every answer she gave only deepened the mystery surrounding the missing hours. As I turned to leave, my eyes briefly settled on the security monitor mounted near the office entrance, and a single unexpected thought crossed my mind. Somewhere inside this building, the cameras had probably recorded exactly what neither of us was willing to explain. The thought stayed with me long after I left Eleanor's office. The security footage. Our executive security team had coordinated the gala with the hotel, which meant exterior footage from the entrance was routinely shared with our security office for a limited time. If I truly wanted answers, perhaps I did not have to depend on memories that refused to return. I only needed to ask whether the recording still existed. The idea followed me through the rest of the afternoon until curiosity finally outweighed hesitation. Just before everyone began leaving for the evening, I made my way downstairs to the security operations office. Mark Reynolds, the company's longtime security director, looked up from his desk and smiled warmly when I entered. "Working late again?" he asked. I returned the smile. "It seems to be that kind of week." We exchanged a few ordinary comments before I carefully chose my words. "Did the hotel send over the exterior footage from last night's gala?" His expression became thoughtful. "Yes. We retain event security copies for 48 hours, then they are automatically deleted unless there is an incident report." My heartbeat quickened. "Would it be possible to review a portion of the recording?" Before Mark could answer, Eleanor spoke from the hallway behind me. "You have every right to see it. But before you do, I would like to tell you exactly what it shows." I turned immediately. Eleanor stood at the open doorway. She was no longer wearing the composed expression she carried into board meetings. Instead, there was something deeply personal in her eyes, almost like concern mixed with regret. Mark looked between us before politely excusing himself to answer a phone call in the next room, leaving the two of us alone. I folded my arms across the borrowed blazer that I still had not returned. "You knew I would come here." Eleanor smiled faintly. "I hoped you would ask me first." I searched her face. "Then tell me why you do not want me to see it." She stepped into the room but kept a respectful distance between us. "Because the video will only show what happened." She paused before continuing. "It cannot explain why every decision was made." I frowned. "Then explain it to me." She looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. "Natalie, last night you were exhausted. The fundraiser lasted much longer than expected. Then the storm arrived. You insisted everyone else leave before you accepted a ride. Then, for almost 20 minutes, I could not find you. Your phone went straight to voicemail, the storm was getting worse, and for the first time in years I was genuinely afraid. When I finally found you at the hotel entrance, you were soaked through and shivering. Tiny fragments flashed through my mind again. Cold rain against my face. Bright headlights reflecting across wet pavement. Eleanor standing beside me beneath a small covered entrance. Her voice softened. You were shivering so badly that I gave you my blazer before the driver arrived. I looked down at the sleeves wrapped around my hands. That part one started to remember. She nodded. The driver brought us back to the penthouse because it was closer than your apartment, and I did not think you should travel across the city while you were feeling that way. Every sentence sounded calm, reasonable, and completely consistent with the woman I had worked beside for 4 years. Yet one question remained. Then why did you seem so afraid of me watching it? Eleanor looked toward the dark monitor. Because I was afraid you would see yourself exhausted and embarrassed, and I confused protecting your dignity with making the choice for you. She met my eyes again. That was not mine to decide. If you want the footage, Mark will show it to you. I looked at her for a long moment. There was no fear in her voice and no attempt to hide wrongdoing, only the uncomfortable honesty of someone admitting that good intentions did not give her the right to choose for me. I glanced at the dark monitor. For the first time, I realized I no longer needed the footage to prove I had been safe. What I still did not understand was why my safety mattered to Eleanor so personally. After we left the security office, neither of us spoke during the elevator ride back to the executive floor. The silence between us no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt delicate, as though every unspoken word carried more weight than anything we could have said aloud. When the elevator doors opened, Eleanor paused before stepping out. Natalie, she said quietly, thank you for trusting me enough to ask the questions instead of believing the worst. I looked at her for a moment before answering. I still do not have all the answers. She nodded gently. I know. There was no frustration in her voice, only patience. That evening I stayed later than usual to finish preparing documents for the following week's board meeting. One by one the office lights across the executive floor switched off as employees headed home. By the time I organized the last folder, the city beyond the windows had become a sea of glittering lights beneath a clear night sky. I finally stood, folded Eleanor's blazer carefully over my arm, and walked toward her office. Her door was open. She was still working beneath the warm glow of a desk lamp, reading through financial reports with the same quiet focus that had made her one of the most respected business leaders in the country. She looked up as I approached and immediately noticed the blazer. You are returning it, she said with a small smile. I nodded. I thought it belonged back with you. Instead of taking it immediately, she looked at it for several seconds before speaking. It kept you warm. That was all I wanted. I gently placed it across the chair beside her desk. Thank you. Our eyes met, and for the first time since the gala I noticed that the uncertainty in her expression had begun to fade. She no longer looked like someone guarding a dangerous secret. She looked like someone hoping I would eventually understand a difficult choice. As I turned to leave, a slim leather notebook resting near the corner of her desk caught my attention. It was partially covered by a stack of reports, and a single folded page extended slightly beyond the cover. Eleanor followed my gaze and quietly reached toward it, but she was a second too late. The page slipped onto the floor. Instinctively I bent to pick it up. My eyes caught only the first handwritten sentence before I could stop myself. I spent 4 years telling myself Natalie was simply the person I trusted most at work. Last night, when I could not find her in the storm, I finally understood how much of my life had quietly come to depend on her being there. I immediately looked away and handed the page back. I am sorry, I said. I was not trying to read it. Eleanor accepted the paper without embarrassment or anger. Instead, she released a slow breath that sounded almost like relief. You were never supposed to find that. I hesitated before asking, is it a speech? She smiled sadly. No. Her fingers rested lightly on the notebook. I started it before dawn this morning and still do not know how to finish it. I wanted to ask another question, but something told me she would answer only when the time was right. As I walked toward the door, she spoke once more. Natalie. I turned back. There is one thing I need you to understand. I waited. She met my eyes with complete sincerity before saying, I never wanted my feelings to become something you felt obligated to carry just because I was your boss. Those words followed me all the way home, and for the first time since waking inside her penthouse, I began to wonder whether the greatest mystery had never been what happened during the storm at all, but how long Eleanor had been quietly protecting a truth she believed she could never ask me to share. The following morning I arrived at headquarters earlier than usual, hoping the quiet hallways would help settle the questions that had followed me home the night before. Instead, every empty corridor reminded me of Eleanor's words. She had not been protecting a secret because she feared the truth. She had been protecting me because she believed her position gave her responsibilities she could never ignore. The thought stayed with me as I unlocked my office and began organizing the day's schedule. At exactly 7:30, a notification appeared on my calendar. Executive Leadership Breakfast. I gathered the meeting folders and walked toward the conference suite, expecting another ordinary morning. Eleanor was already there, reviewing financial projections beside the large windows overlooking the San Francisco skyline. She looked up with a warm smile that seemed a little less guarded than before. Good morning, Natalie. Good morning. For a brief moment we simply stood there in comfortable silence. The tension that had surrounded us since the gala had begun to change. It no longer felt like uncertainty. It felt like two people slowly learning how to be honest without rushing the process. During the meeting I noticed something I had somehow overlooked for years. Eleanor listened more than she spoke. She thanked junior employees for small contributions that others barely noticed. When difficult questions arose, she never searched for someone to blame. She searched for solutions. I realized that the kindness she had shown me after the gala was not an exception. It was simply who she had always been. After the executives left, she remained behind gathering her papers. I offered to help, and together we organized the folders in quiet rhythm. Can I ask you something? I said. She smiled gently. You usually ask several things. I laughed softly. Have you always been like this? She looked puzzled. Like what? Taking care of everyone before yourself. She paused before answering. Most people forget what was said in a meeting. They remember whether they felt respected in the room. Her answer stayed with me throughout the day. That afternoon I stopped by the archives department to retrieve older financial records. While waiting, I unexpectedly met Grace Collins, the event coordinator who had organized the charity gala. She greeted me warmly before saying, I have been meaning to thank Eleanor. I looked up with curiosity. For what? Grace smiled. After the fundraiser ended, everyone else rushed to leave because of the storm. She stayed behind helping volunteers pack donations. Until the last guest had gone. Then she spent another hour making sure nobody traveled alone in the weather. I felt another small piece of the previous evening quietly fall into place. Eleanor had never been thinking about herself. Grace continued with a thoughtful smile. She seemed especially concerned about you. She kept asking whether someone had found you a dry coat. I thanked her and slowly returned upstairs. My heart felt unexpectedly lighter. The missing memories no longer frightened me the way they had before. Each new detail made one thing harder to ignore. Eleanor had spent the entire night looking after everyone else, and somehow I had never noticed how often she did that. Late that evening I passed Eleanor's office on my way out. She was standing by the window watching the lights appear across the city. She turned as I approached and asked, "Feeling better today?" I nodded sincerely. "Much better." She smiled, relieved in a way she did not try to hide anymore. As I prepared to leave, my phone vibrated with a new message from Human Resources confirming that annual internal transfer requests would open the following week. I stared at the notification for several seconds before quietly slipping the phone back into my pocket, because for the first time an unexpected thought entered my mind. Perhaps the greatest obstacle between Eleanor and me had never been the unanswered questions about one rainy night. Perhaps it had always been the titles we carried every single day. The Human Resources notification remained on my mind for the rest of the week. Every time I opened my calendar or reviewed another executive schedule, the same thought returned. An internal transfer would not erase the past, but it could remove the one barrier Eleanor had respected more than her own feelings. She had never treated me differently because she cared about me. If anything, she had been even more careful to protect my independence. The realization filled me with equal parts gratitude and sadness. On Friday afternoon of the following week, I requested a private meeting with her, using the same scheduling system we had relied on for years. When I entered her office, she immediately closed her laptop and gave me her full attention. "You sounded serious in your message," she said gently. I smiled, trying to hide my nervousness. "I think this conversation deserves that." She nodded for me to continue. I placed a single document on her desk. It was my completed request for an internal transfer to the company's charitable foundation, a division that reported to its own independent board rather than directly to the chief executive officer. Eleanor looked at the form for several long seconds without speaking. When she finally lifted her eyes to mine, I saw surprise mixed with concern. "Natalie," she said quietly, "did I do something to make you want to leave my office?" I shook my head immediately. "No. You did exactly the opposite." She waited patiently, allowing me to find the words in my own time. "You spent days protecting me because you believed your position mattered more than your own happiness. I finally understand why." I smiled softly. "You wanted every choice I made to be completely free." Her expression softened. "That has always mattered to me." I nodded. "Then this is my choice." I slid the transfer request a little closer to her. "I love the work we have done together, and I will always be grateful for everything you have taught me. But I do not want my job title to become the reason two honest people spend years pretending they do not feel what they already know." The room became perfectly still. Eleanor lowered her eyes to the document once more before quietly asking, "Have you thought this through?" I laughed softly. "More than I have thought through anything in my life." She stood and slowly walked toward the windows overlooking the city. I joined her a moment later, leaving a respectful distance between us. The afternoon sun reflected across the glass, turning the skyline into countless points of light. "I wrote that unfinished letter because I believed silence was the only ethical decision," Eleanor admitted. "I convinced myself that caring about you meant never asking anything of you." I looked at her with complete sincerity. "You never asked anything of me." She turned toward me. "Then why are you doing this?" I answered without hesitation. "Because I am asking something of myself." She searched my face as though trying to decide whether she could finally believe what she was hearing. "I want every future conversation between us to happen because two women freely chose it, not because one happened to sign the other's performance review." She looked away for a moment and blinked once before trusting herself to speak. I had seen Eleanor control entire rooms without effort. I had never seen her work this hard to steady her own voice. As I prepared to leave her office, she looked at the transfer request one final time before saying softly, "If this becomes official, there will no longer be any professional reason for me to keep hiding what has been in my heart for a very long time." The next 2 weeks passed more quietly than either of us expected. Human Resources approved my transfer after the charitable foundation's independent board completed its review, with Eleanor formally recused from the process. Suddenly, the routine that had defined our professional lives for 4 years began to change. We still greeted each other every morning. We still discussed ongoing projects whenever necessary. Yet every conversation carried a different feeling now. The line was still there until my transfer became official, but for the first time it had an end date. On my final afternoon as Eleanor's executive assistant, the office surprised me with a small farewell gathering. Colleagues shared stories about impossible deadlines we had somehow survived together, successful charity events, and long evenings preparing presentations before major conferences. Eleanor stood quietly near the back of the room, smiling as everyone else spoke first. When the room finally grew still, she stepped forward holding a small gift box wrapped in simple navy paper. "This is not from the company," she said. "It is from me." I accepted it with both hands. Inside rested a fountain pen engraved with a single sentence. "Thank you for making every ordinary day better." I looked up at her, unable to speak for several seconds. "You remembered I always preferred writing important notes by hand," I whispered. She smiled gently. "I remember many things." Those words carried an entirely different meaning now. After everyone returned to work, I remained behind to organize the last few files in my office. Eleanor appeared in the doorway carrying one familiar garment folded neatly across her arm. Her navy blazer. "I believe this belongs to its original owner," she said with a warm smile. I laughed softly. "I think it already found its way home once." She looked down at the blazer before carefully placing it over the back of a chair instead of taking it away. Perhaps it did. We stood together in comfortable silence, with the end of those professional titles finally in sight. "My transfer officially begins on Monday," I said. She nodded. "I received the confirmation this morning." I searched her expression. "You seem relieved." She answered with complete honesty. "Because now every decision belongs entirely to you." I took one slow breath, realizing this was the first time I could see an end to the professional roles that had always stood between us. "Then I should probably tell you something before Monday arrives." Eleanor waited patiently, just as she always had. "When I woke up inside your penthouse, I believed the biggest mystery was what happened during the storm." I smiled gently. "I was wrong." She tilted her head slightly. "What do you think the real mystery was?" I met her eyes without hesitation. "How I worked beside someone for 4 years without realizing she had quietly become the person I trusted more than anyone else." The afternoon sunlight filled the office with a soft golden glow as she stepped a little closer, still leaving enough space for my answer to remain completely my own. "Natalie," she said almost in a whisper, "there is something I have wanted to tell you for a very long time, but I refused to say it while I was responsible for your career." I felt my heartbeat quicken, not from uncertainty anymore, but from hope. She smiled with the calm confidence I had admired from the very beginning. "After your first day at the foundation, if you still want to hear what I have been trying not to say, let me take you to dinner next Friday." "Not as your boss." "Not with you as my assistant." Just Eleanor asking Natalie whether there might be something here worth finding out. 1 year later I found myself standing beneath the same floor-to-ceiling windows in Eleanor's penthouse, but everything about the room felt different. The polished marble floors were still there. The view of the San Francisco skyline remained just as breathtaking. Yet the space no longer felt like the home of a woman who spent every waking hour carrying the weight of an international company alone. It had become warm, welcoming, and unmistakably lived in. Fresh flowers rested on the dining table. Books filled shelves that had once displayed only business awards. Framed photographs from weekend trips lined the hallway, each one capturing quiet moments neither of us had planned but both of us treasured. My transfer to the charitable foundation had become one of the happiest decisions of my life. The work challenged me in new ways, and for the first time Eleanor and I could speak without wondering whether our conversations might blur professional boundaries. Our first dinner after my transfer had lasted almost 4 hours because neither of us wanted the evening to end. One dinner became many. Long walks along the waterfront became weekend traditions. Coffee before work became breakfast together almost every morning. Nothing about our relationship happened suddenly. It grew the same way trust had always grown between us, one ordinary day at a time. That afternoon I stood in the living room waiting while Eleanor disappeared into the hallway. She returned carrying something folded carefully across her arms. the navy blazer. She smiled as she held it toward me. I think this belongs to you now. I laughed softly. It has always belonged to you. She gently shook her head. Maybe. Her eyes met mine with quiet affection. But every time I see it now, I remember the morning I realized protecting someone is not always about keeping secrets. Sometimes it is about waiting until the truth can be shared without fear. I slowly slipped the blazer over my shoulders. It fit exactly the way I remembered, warm, familiar, and unexpectedly comforting. This time there were no missing memories, no unanswered questions, and no uncertainty waiting inside the fabric. There was only gratitude. I reached into the inside pocket out of simple curiosity. My fingers touched another folded piece of paper. I looked up at Eleanor, who smiled with the unmistakable expression of someone who had been hoping I would find it. I carefully unfolded the note. In her elegant handwriting were just a few simple words. Thank you for trusting me long enough to let the truth become a choice for both of us. My eyes filled with tears before I even realized I was smiling. I looked back at her. I think I finally remember the most important part of that night. She tilted her head gently. What is that? I stepped closer and answered with complete certainty. It was never about the storm. It was about discovering that the safest place I had ever been was beside the person who expected nothing from me except honesty. Eleanor reached for my hand, giving me every chance to step away if I wished. Instead, I held hers with quiet confidence. Looking back, I realized the missing memories had never been the heart of our story. What mattered was what Eleanor did not do. She never used her position to ask for something I might have felt unable to refuse. She waited. I chose. And only then did we find out what had been quietly growing between us all along. Maybe that is why I still keep the blazer. Not because of the night I forgot, but because of everything we were finally free to remember afterward.